Whimsy's expression altered in that peculiar manner, which those who knew him well had learned to associate with the moment when his considerable intellect shifted from idle speculation into something approaching genuine attention. He uncrossed his legs, set down his teacup with a deliberateness that suggested finality, and turned to face Roderick with an intensity that made his friend decidedly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Bramwell," he said, not as a question, but as a statement requiring confirmation. "The same Mrs. Bramwell who discovered the cottage in disarray?" Roderick nodded miserably. "She'd been with us for 22 years, entirely reliable, entirely trusted. My wife was particularly fond of her. The physician says there's no possibility she survived the dose she took. It was administered sometime in the night, probably between 10 o'clock and midnight, though the servants heard nothing unusual. She was found at 7:30 this morning by the under-housemaid when she failed to come down for breakfast. Had she been in low spirits? Not noticeably. Indeed, she'd been rather more animated than usual these past few days. She'd taken to questioning the servants about Mrs. Velicott, asking them to recall any details they might have observed, her habits, her correspondence, the hours she kept. I thought at the time that she was simply being conscientious, concerned about the disruption to the household." Whimsy rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in that posture which habitually preceded his most incisive observations. The view was precisely what one might expect of a country house of considerable standing, rolling lawns descending toward a ha-ha, mature oaks and chestnuts. A small ornamental lake with an island containing a rather melancholy folly of sorts. Beyond, visible through the gathering afternoon mist, were the distant downs and what appeared to be the remains of some Roman fortification, its stones grey and weather-worn against the darkening sky. "You said the larder was emptied," he continued, without turning from the window. "Not ransacked, you said, but emptied methodically. Which suggests purpose, knowledge, and opportunity. Someone knew what was valuable and where it was kept. Someone knew the household rhythms well enough to perform this evacuation without detection. And someone, I would conjecture, knew Mrs. Bramwell well enough to predict her behavior upon discovering the loss. But the larder was only noticed yesterday morning," Roderick protested. "The loss occurred at least 3 or 4 days ago, based on the state of the perishables that remained. Mrs. Bramwell would have discovered it almost immediately upon returning from her visit to Blackthorn Cottage." Whimsy turned from the window, and there was something in his expression that reminded Roderick quite forcibly why his friend had acquired such a formidable reputation in certain circles. Then the sequence becomes rather more interesting, doesn't it? Mrs. Velicott arrives, establishes herself as respectable and unremarkable. 2 weeks pass. Mrs. Bramwell discovers the cottage ransacked and Mrs. Velicott gone. Presumably Mrs. Bramwell reports this to you? She did. She was quite distressed about it, and during those intervening days, between the discovery and Mrs. Bramwell's death, what exactly was she doing? You said she was questioning the servants, making inquiries. Did anyone object to her attentions? Did anyone seem particularly anxious about what she might discover? Roderick seemed to consider this with the expression of a man attempting to recall details he had not previously thought significant. There was young Thomas, he's the boot boy, who apparently was rather evasive when she asked him about whether he'd seen Mrs. Velicott leaving the cottage with anything. But Thomas is evasive by nature. He's not a bright lad, and he's terrified of Mrs. Bramwell. Of Mrs. Bramwell, I should say. And the cook? Margaret? No, she seemed perfectly frank about everything. She mentioned that Mrs. Velicott had taken meals in her cottage. Very simple meals, nothing unusual. What of the gardeners, the stable staff, the postboy? I'm not certain what the gardeners might have observed. And as for the postboy, he only comes 3 times a week." Whimsy returned to his chair and folded himself into it with the grace of a man who had practiced the gesture extensively. "Then I think," he said, "we must have a rather more systematic conversation with everyone who had access to the house, the larder, and the village during the period in question. But first, I should very much like to see 3 things. The cottage where Mrs. Vellacott was residing, the larder from which these valuables have vanished, and the room in which Mrs. Bramwell spent her final hours. Particularly, I should like to examine the laudanum bottle, if it still exists, and to speak with the under-housemaid who discovered the body. She will have observed things that others may not have thought to mention." He paused, and added with the sort of casual afterthought that nevertheless conveyed considerable significance, "And you might also provide me with a complete list of everyone currently residing in the house, including the servants, their positions, their tenure, and their relationships to one another. These domestic arrangements are so frequently the source of the most exquisite complications. One would be astonished how often murder is committed not by those with the most obvious motive, but by those with the most intimate knowledge of household routine." The examination of Blackthorn Cottage proved considerably more illuminating than the initial police investigation had suggested, though Whimsy's observations were delivered in that infuriatingly oblique manner which left Roderick uncertain whether his friend was commenting upon the weather, the architectural deficiencies of Victorian construction, or the central mystery at hand. The cottage itself was modest but well appointed. A compact structure of rendered stone with a slate roof and the sort of generically pleasant interior that suggested someone had furnished it with items selected specifically to convey an impression of respectability without revealing anything whatsoever of their purchaser's true nature or predilections. The ransacking, Whimsy observed, kneeling beside an overturned writing desk with a cigarette dangling from his lips, was performed by someone who knew precisely what they were seeking and approximately where it might be located. Notice that the bedroom furniture has been disturbed, but only the drawers. The wardrobe remains relatively undisturbed. The kitchen has not been touched at all. This is not the work of a common burglar, who would have been considerably less discriminating in his depredations. He rose with fluid grace, moving toward the window that faced the manor house across the parkland. From here, one can observe the main drive and the servants' approach to the larder. Someone leaving this cottage carrying heavy items would necessarily have been visible to anyone watching from the manor, or, conversely, would have required the cooperation of someone who could ensure that no one was watching at the critical moment. Roderick attempted to interpose a question, but Whimsy had already moved on, his attention captured by the small writing desk from which Mrs. Vellacott's personal papers had been recovered. "The letters," Whimsy said, returning to the documents that Roderick had thoughtfully brought along, "are entirely innocuous, as you said. A correspondence with a boarding-house keeper in South Kensington, several bills from London merchants, a note from a solicitor regarding an annuity. All perfectly mundane. And yet someone wished them destroyed, or if not destroyed, then at least located and examined, which rather suggests that Mrs. Vellacott's true identity, or at least her true circumstances, were other than what she claimed." He selected one envelope and held it up to the afternoon light filtering through the cottage window. "This is interesting. The paper is of excellent quality, the handwriting educated, but the postmark is smudged. Someone has deliberately obscured it. Not Mrs. Vellacott herself, I would conjecture. That would be unnecessarily cautious for someone genuinely of her station. Rather, someone who wished to conceal the location from which this letter originated." They returned to the manor as the light began its final descent, and Whimsy's subsequent examination of the larder proved, if anything, even more curious than his observations concerning the cottage. Mrs. Bramwell's meticulous housekeeping had left detailed inventories of the stores, and it was apparent that whoever had removed the items had possessed not merely knowledge of their location, but understanding of what constituted genuine value. The expensive wines remained largely untouched, a curious omission for a common thief, but the silver serving pieces, a particularly fine tea service, and a quantity of candied fruits from a London confectioner had been removed with systematic precision. "Here," Whimsy said. Running his fingers along an empty shelf, the dust pattern indicates that whatever stood here was not removed hastily. Notice how evenly the surface has been wiped. Someone took considerable time and care with this work. They brought something to transport their plunder, perhaps a cart, perhaps simply a large carpet bag, and they knew with certainty which items were portable, which possessed value, and which could be left without arousing immediate suspicion. He turned to examine the inventory ledger that Mrs. Bramwell had maintained with the precision of an accountant. When would this have been taken, do you suppose? Roderick consulted the list of dated entries. The last inventory was taken on the morning of September the 19th. The items were discovered missing on the 24th. So, between the 19th and the 24th, 5 days. And Mrs. Velicott disappeared on the 20th? Yes. The morning after the larder had been emptied, or so we must assume. Whimsy closed the ledger with a decisive gesture and turned his attention to the under-housemaid who had been summoned to provide her account of discovering Mrs. Bramwell. The girl, whose name was Annie and whose age could not have been more than 16, was visibly terrified of the elegant gentleman questioning her with such courteous attention. "You found her at 7:30, Whimsy said, without preamble. "The door to her room was locked or unlocked?" "Locked, sir. I had to fetch Mr. Hartley, that's the butler, sir, to open it. She was in her bed, sir, very peaceful-like. I thought at first she was simply sleeping very heavily. Was there a glass beside the bed? A cup?" Annie hesitated, her eyes darting toward Roderick as though seeking permission to speak. "There was a glass, sir. Empty. It smelled something awful, like flowers and bitter almonds together. Mr. Hartley said later that was the laudanum. And where was the laudanum bottle?" "That's just the thing, sir," Annie said, her voice dropping to something approaching a whisper. "It wasn't there at all. There was nothing on the table beside her bed except the glass. Mr. Hartley searched everywhere, but he never found the bottle. It was like someone had taken it away after she'd drunk from it." Whimsy's eyebrows rose in that characteristic manner which suggested he had just encountered something of decidedly more consequence than mere domestic inconvenience. "How very curious," he murmured, addressing not Annie but the room itself, as though the empty air might provide explanation where the human agents involved could not. The laudanum bottle disappeared. Not mislaid, not overlooked in some corner by the constabulary, but deliberately removed. Which rather transforms the matter from suicide into something considerably more theatrical and considerably more premeditated. He dismissed Annie with a kindness that brought forth tears of relief from the terrified girl, and turned his attention to the butler, a man named Hartley, who possessed that particular combination of professional discretion and latent anxiety that suggested he had observed considerably more than he had yet been prompted to reveal. Whimsy conducted this interview in the library, a room lined with the sorts of books that suggested previous owners had purchased them primarily for decorative purposes, and settled himself into a leather chair with the air of a man preparing for an extended and potentially illuminating conversation. "You discovered the bottle's absence immediately, I presume?" Hartley shifted his weight uncomfortably. "I did, sir. When I opened the door to Miss Annie's knock, I observed Mrs. Bramwell at once. The physician was summoned, but there was no question she'd been dead some hours. I conducted a preliminary examination of the room, as seemed proper, and I noted the absence of the bottle almost immediately. I mentioned it to Mr. Ashworth, naturally, but he seemed rather distressed and instructed me not to speak of it further. Did you search the room thoroughly?" "I did, sir. I examined every surface, opened every drawer, looked beneath the bed and behind the furniture. The bottle was simply not present. And yet someone had provided Mrs. Bramwell with laudanum. Someone had brought it to her room, convinced her to drink it, and then removed the evidence, all without leaving any trace of their presence or any indication of struggle. Tell me, Hartley, was Mrs. Bramwell in the habit of taking sedatives? Did she suffer from insomnia or nervous complaints? The butler's expression became notably more guarded. Not that I was aware of, sir. She had always been a woman of robust constitution and even temperament. There was no indication that she required pharmaceutical assistance for her rest. Yet she apparently took a fatal dose without resistance or apparent distress. Someone she trusted entered her room, provided her with a glass containing laudanum dissolved in some liquid, water perhaps, or milk, and she consumed it without question, which suggests either that the laudanum was masked by whatever vehicle carried it, or that she was expecting the visitor and had no reason to suspect malice. Whimsy rose and began to pace the library in that restless manner which invariably preceded his most incisive deductions. Consider the timeline. Mrs. Vellacott arrives 3 weeks ago, establishes herself as respectable and unremarkable. 2 weeks pass without incident. On the 19th, the larder is emptied of valuables, a carefully planned operation requiring knowledge, opportunity, and assistance. On the 20th, Mrs. Vellacott departs, leaving her cottage in apparent disarray. On the 21st, Mrs. Bramwell discovers this disarray and begins making inquiries among the servants. Between the 21st and the 24th, she pursues these inquiries with apparent diligence. On the night of the 24th, she is given laudanum, which she drinks willingly. On the morning of the 25th, she is discovered dead, and the bottle is gone. He paused before the fireplace, studying the arrangement of items on the mantelpiece with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to their apparent insignificance. What was the nature of Mrs. Bramwell's inquiries? You said she questioned the servants about Mrs. Vellacott. What specifically did she wish to know? Hartley's discomfort had intensified to something approaching visible distress. She was particularly interested in whether anyone had observed Mrs. Vellacott in the company of other individuals, whether she had received visitors or left the cottage in the company of others, whether anyone had observed her carrying parcels or packages. And what answers did she receive? That is where the matter becomes somewhat delicate, sir. The head gardener, Mr. Calvert, mentioned to me afterward that Mrs. Bramwell had questioned him quite extensively about whether he had observed anyone approaching the larder building from the direction of the cottage. He said he'd seen nothing, naturally, but he seemed somewhat concerned that she should have asked such a specific question. Whimsy's entire demeanor altered in that moment, as though a crucial piece of some invisible puzzle had suddenly materialized before him. He turned from the mantelpiece with an expression of such focused intensity that Hartley found himself involuntarily stepping backward. "The larder building," Whimsy repeated, his voice carrying that particular quality of detached observation that preceded his most cutting pronouncements. Mrs. Bramwell knew, or at least suspected, that there was a direct connection between Mrs. Vellacott's presence at the cottage and the disappearance of the valuables from the larder. She possessed either evidence or deduction that indicated collusion between the cottage and the manor, and someone who overheard her inquiries, or who was informed of them, decided that Mrs. Bramwell's continued curiosity represented an unacceptable risk. He turned to address Hartley directly, his eyes containing that peculiar gleam that suggested he was now engaged in the work he found most genuinely engaging. "I should like a complete account of everyone who was present in the manor house on the night of the 24th. Everyone, servants, family members, guests. I wish to know their movements, their occupations, and most particularly I wish to know who possessed access to laudanum. And I wish to know it before dinner. The investigation into the household's nocturnal activities revealed a pattern of domestic life considerably more complicated than the surface civility of the Ashworth establishment had initially suggested. Hartley's meticulous account, coupled with Whimsy's systematic questioning of each servant in turn, began to construct a chronology that was far from the simple narrative of natural death that the local constabulary had been so eager to accept. The house on the evening of the 24th had contained, besides Roderick and his wife Margaret, their son Theodore, a young man of 28 who occupied rooms in the east wing and who had, according to the servants, been out until approximately 10:30 in the evening. Their daughter Victoria had retired early complaining of a headache. The cook, Margaret Hutchins, had been in her quarters by 9 o'clock, as was her custom. The undergardener, a taciturn individual named Watkins, had been seen leaving the estate at 7 in the evening and had not returned until the following morning. Most significantly, the head gardener, Mr. Calvert, had been observed by 2 separate witnesses to be in the larder building at approximately 8 o'clock, ostensibly conducting an inventory of stored vegetables. Curious, Whimsy observed, settling himself in the library with his notebook and a whiskey which he held but did not drink, that Mr. Calvert should have been inventorying vegetables at 8 o'clock in the evening. The larder inventories have been Mrs. Bramwell's responsibility for 22 years, you said? Roderick, who had become progressively more distressed as the afternoon had advanced, nodded miserably. He claimed he was simply checking on the condition of the root crops. The autumn varieties require particular care and storage. Did Mrs. Bramwell customarily allow others to conduct her inventories? Absolutely not. She was quite proprietary about the larder. She rarely allowed anyone to enter without her permission. Whimsy set down his untouched whiskey and rose to examine the household register that Hartley had provided. It was a document of considerable detail, listing not merely the names and positions of the staff, but also the dates of their engagement and any particular skills or relationships they possessed. Theodore, he said, apparently at random. Your son. He was out until 10:30. Where does one go at that hour from a village such as Ashworth, precisely? There is presumably a public house. A young man might visit friends, but 10:30 suggests either a considerable distance traveled or a deliberate late return designed to occasion remark. Theodore sometimes visits friends in the neighboring village, Roderick said defensively. He is not a particularly studious young man, I'm afraid. He prefers the company of sporting acquaintances to the pursuits one might wish for a gentleman. And his financial circumstances? Is he in debt? Does he require money? He has an allowance, but he manages it poorly. There have been occasions when he has required additional funds. Whimsy's expression suggested he had just encountered something of considerable significance, though his tone remained one of conversational interest. How interesting. A young man of limited accomplishment, uncertain prospects, and chronic financial embarrassment, the sort of individual who might find himself vulnerable to suggestion from someone offering either employment or financial relief. Tell me, has Theodore ever been in the company of Mrs. Vellacott? Not that I'm aware of. My wife mentioned seeing them in conversation at the church, but they were merely being civil. Did your wife report anything unusual about this conversation? She said that Mrs. Vellacott had made some remark about Theodore's appearance, commenting that he resembled someone she had known in London. Nothing more than polite small talk. Whimsy returned to his chair and steepled his fingers in that posture which preceded his most penetrating observations. I begin to perceive the architecture of this affair, he said quietly, though the foundation remains somewhat obscure. We have Mrs. Vellacott, who arrives with impeccable credentials and establishes herself as a woman of respectable means and solitary habits. We have the systematic removal of valuable items from the larder, performed with knowledge and care. We have Mrs. Bramwell, who suspects collusion between the cottage and the manor, and who conducts inquiries into this possible connection. We have Theodore, a young man of uncertain prospects and financial difficulties, whose movements on the critical evening were conveniently absent. And we have Mr. Calvert, the head gardener, whose presence in the larder building at 8 o'clock required explanation, and whose previous interactions with Mrs. Bramwell had apparently occasioned some anxiety. He paused, allowing the implications of his observations to settle upon Roderick like a fog descending upon the downs. "What we do not yet have," he continued, "is clear evidence of motive, opportunity, and method as they apply to the actual commission of the crime. Someone provided Mrs. Bramwell with laudanum. Someone removed the bottle afterward. Someone possessed sufficient knowledge of the household to ensure that this action would not be observed. And someone had a compelling reason to prevent Mrs. Bramwell from continuing her inquiries." He rose and moved toward the window, where the evening had begun its transformation of the landscape into shadow and suggestion. "I should very much like to conduct a more thorough examination of Theodore's rooms, and I should like to interview Mr. Calvert at considerably greater length. But first, I think we must establish whether Mrs. Bramwell left any record of her suspicions. Women of her type, conscientious, observant, of established position, frequently commit their thoughts to paper. If we can locate any such document, we may find that Mrs. Bramwell has, through her own diligent investigation, provided us with the very evidence that cost her her life. The search of Mrs. Bramwell's quarters, conducted with Roderick's reluctant permission and in the presence of Hartley, who maintained a demeanor of profound discomfort throughout, yielded results that were both illuminating and troubling in their implications. Mrs. Bramwell had maintained her room with the same meticulous attention to order that had characterized her management of the household. But it was immediately apparent that someone had conducted a systematic examination of her personal effects subsequent to her death. The drawers of her writing desk had been opened and then carefully replaced, though not with sufficient precision to deceive the trained observation of Lord Peter Wimsey. The papers within had been disturbed, their arrangement altered from whatever pattern Mrs. Bramwell had maintained. "Interesting," Wimsey observed, running his fingers across the desk's interior with the delicacy of a man examining a particularly rare manuscript. "Someone has searched this room, and searched it thoroughly, but with the intention of concealing their search rather than announcing it. This was accomplished after her death. Naturally, the constabulary would have noted such disturbance had it been apparent during their initial examination, which suggests that whoever performed this search did so during the night, after the body had been discovered, but before any formal sealing of the room occurred." He produced from a drawer a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and the handwriting within exhibiting the characteristic precision of someone accustomed to recording domestic minutiae. "Mrs. Bramwell kept a diary," he said, opening it with considerable care. "Or rather, a comprehensive record of household accounts and observations. Let us see what she had observed, and when." The entries progressed with methodical regularity through August and into September, documenting nothing more remarkable than the price of butter, the state of the preserves, and the occasional notation regarding servant conduct. But as the entries approached the 21st of September, the tone altered perceptibly. On that date, Mrs. Bramwell had written, "Discovery at cottage occasioned considerable distress. All items appeared to have been removed with purpose and method. No signs of common burglary. Query, was removal conducted with knowledge of household assistants? Observed scratches upon lock, suggests use of implement other than key. Shall make discreet inquiries." The subsequent entries documented her questions to the servants with precision, noting their responses and, more significantly, their emotional reactions to her inquiries. Young Thomas appeared anxious and evasive, though this may be his natural disposition. Mr. Calvert denied observing anything of note, but his manner suggested some concern regarding the direction of questioning. Miss Victoria seemed entirely disinterested, which is perhaps unsurprising. Theodore was not present to question. By the 23rd, Mrs. Bramwell's observations had become considerably more pointed. Head gardener's presence in larder at 8 o'clock on evening of 19th requires explanation. His response, that he was merely inspecting root crops, lacks credibility. Mrs. Hutchins states he never requested permission, which is entirely contrary to established procedure. Observation: direct pathway from cottage to larder building passes through kitchen garden, where Mr. Calvert would possess knowledge of schedules and movements. Conclusion: possible connection between cottage activities and manor house theft requires further investigation. The final entry, dated the 24th, was considerably briefer. Have arranged meeting with Hartley to discuss observations. Shall present findings regarding Mr. Calvert's activities. Must determine whether involvement is innocent or culpable. Whimsy closed the journal with a deliberateness that suggested finality, and turned to Roderick with an expression that combined sympathy with something approaching grim satisfaction. "Your housekeeper," he said quietly, had begun to assemble a coherent narrative regarding the removal of the valuables. She had identified Mr. Calvert as a likely participant, or at minimum as an individual whose knowledge and position made him essential to the operation. She had arranged to discuss her findings with Hartley, a step which, had it occurred, would have set in motion an official investigation that could not have been suppressed or diverted. Then Calvert killed her, Roderick said, the words emerging as though forced from some deep cavity of despair. He learned of her intentions, provided her with laudanum, and murdered her to silence her. Partially, Whimsy conceded, but the matter is considerably more subtle than simple elimination of a witness. Consider, who informed Calvert that Mrs. Bramwell intended to present her findings to Hartley? She had not yet done so when she was murdered. She would have conducted this conversation the following morning, presumably. Therefore, someone informed Calvert of her intentions, provided him with the motivation to act, and perhaps even supplied him with the means, the laudanum itself. He moved toward the window, regarding the darkening landscape with an intensity that suggested he was observing not the external geography, but rather the internal architecture of human motive and consequence. And consider further, Calvert is a man of modest education and considerable physical strength. He would not have access to laudanum except through another individual, nor would he have possessed the knowledge necessary to execute such a crime with the precision it was executed. The removal of the bottle afterward, the careful staging of the scene to suggest willing consumption, these suggest a mind of considerably greater sophistication and cunning. Whimsy turned to face them, his expression containing that peculiar combination of intellectual satisfaction and human sadness that those who knew him recognized as the prelude to some uncomfortable revelation. "We must examine Theodore's rooms," he said, "and we must do so with particular attention to his recent acquisitions, his correspondence, and most significantly, any evidence of his recent associations. I suspect, you see, that Mrs. Vellacott was not merely a woman of respectable means traveling incognito. I suspect she was a woman who possessed considerable knowledge of your family's circumstances, considerable acquaintance with your son's financial difficulties, and a well-developed plan to exploit both. And I further suspect that Theodore, in his desperation and foolishness, became entangled in a scheme whose consequences he neither anticipated nor could subsequently control. Theodore's rooms revealed themselves to be precisely what one might have anticipated from a young man of his temperament and circumstances. A study in disorder masquerading as careless affluence, with expensive items scattered amid evidence of financial desperation. The furnishings were pleasant enough, the appointments suggesting comfort if not luxury. But the desk contained bills from London tailors, notes from creditors demanding payment, and correspondence from a moneylender that suggested Theodore's financial embarrassment had progressed considerably beyond the realm of mere allowance deficiency. Whimsy examined these documents with the focused attention of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. his expression remaining characteristically neutral even as the implications of what he was reading became increasingly evident. £300, he murmured, holding aloft one particularly damning letter. A sum loaned at interest rates that would have been considered criminal in a less permissive age. The debt was incurred 8 weeks ago, which would place it shortly before Mrs. Vellacott's arrival. The moneylender is a gentleman by the name of Hargrove, operating from premises in Whitechapel. Not the sort of individual one conducts business with through choice, but rather through the exhaustion of more respectable alternatives. He placed the letter aside and continued his examination, eventually producing from beneath a loose floorboard a collection of items that suggested the systematic preparation of some significant undertaking. There were sketches of the manor house, drawn with amateur hand but demonstrating considerable attention to architectural detail. There were notes regarding the daily routines of the household staff, their hours of occupation, the times at which various portions of the estate lay unobserved. Most significantly, there was a letter, dated approximately 6 weeks prior, written in an educated hand that bore considerable similarity to the correspondence discovered at Blackthorn Cottage. "My dear Theodore," Whimsy read aloud, his voice carrying that particular quality of detached irony that suggested he was providing commentary upon a theatrical performance rather than upon the tragic consequences of human folly. "I have made inquiries regarding your circumstances, and I find that we may be of considerable service to one another. Your difficulties are, as you have intimated, pressing. My requirements are specific but not, I believe, beyond your capacity to fulfill. I propose that we meet to discuss an arrangement that might prove mutually advantageous. You need not concern yourself regarding my identity or motivation. Suffice to say that I am in a position to resolve your immediate financial embarrassments, provided you are willing to undertake certain actions within your own household. I shall establish myself in the village under an assumed name, and we shall coordinate our activities with the utmost discretion. Destroy this letter. Speak of this matter to no one. The consequences of indiscretion would be considerably more severe than your present difficulties. Your obedient servant, C.V. Whimsy, lowered the letter and turned to face Roderick with an expression of profound disappointment. Your son, he said with devastating quietness, has been complicit in a carefully orchestrated scheme to rob his own household. Mrs. Vellacott, or whatever her true name might be, identified Theodore's financial vulnerability, made contact with him through intermediaries, and offered him a solution that appeared simple and without serious consequence. She would establish herself in the village, gain access to the manor through Theodore's cooperation, identify and remove items of value from the larder, and share the proceeds with him. The arrangement would pay his debts and provide him with funds sufficient to maintain his lifestyle without forcing him to confront the reality of his circumstances. Roderick's face had assumed a grayish pallor that suggested the shock of revelation was proving considerably more severe than even his distress of the preceding hours had indicated. "But that would mean," he began, and then faltered. "That would mean Theodore was responsible, however indirectly, for Mrs. Bramwell's death. More directly than you perhaps wish to acknowledge," Whimsy said, returning to his examination of the scattered papers. "Mrs. Bramwell became suspicious and initiated inquiries. Someone, most probably Theodore himself, informed Mrs. Vellacott and Mr. Calvert of these inquiries. Mrs. Vellacott, possessing considerably more ruthlessness and sophistication than young Theodore, determined that Mrs. Bramwell represented an unacceptable threat to the continuation of her activities. She obtained laudanum, possibly from a physician under some pretext, possibly from a chemist in the neighboring town, and arranged for its administration to Mrs. Bramwell. Whether Calvert was the instrument of this deed, or whether Mrs. Vellacott herself entered the manor house, remains to be determined. but the logic of the sequence is inescapable. He produced from among Theodore's possessions a small account ledger, its pages containing meticulous records of sums received and sums disbursed. Your son has recorded here the payments he received from this arrangement. £50 per instance of cooperation, with 2 payments recorded before the critical date of September the 19th. He was, in essence, a paid accomplice in the robbery of his own family's property. Whimsy set the ledger aside and turned his attention to one final item, a key, unremarkable in appearance, that had been hidden within a boot in Theodore's wardrobe. This, he said, holding it up to the lamplight, is almost certainly a key to the Larder building, obtained through culvert and used to facilitate the removal of the valuables. With this key, access could be gained at any hour without requiring the cooperation of those who maintained the official keys. He turned to address Roderick directly, his expression containing an unusual degree of sympathy even as he delivered his judgments. We must now determine where Theodore has gone, what he knew of Mrs. Vellicott's intentions regarding Mrs. Bramwell, and whether he constitutes a continuing danger to others in this household. More significantly, we must locate Mrs. Vellicott herself, establish her true identity, and determine whether her crimes extend beyond this particular exploitation. It is possible, though I must confess unlikely, that your son was genuinely ignorant of her intention to murder your housekeeper. It is considerably more probable that he suspected, or even knew, and remained silent through cowardice or fear of the consequences to himself. Theodore was located, through the methodical efforts of Whimsy and a discreetly summoned Scotland Yard inspector by the name of Marchbanks, in a modest lodging-house in Brighton, where he had apparently fled in a state of considerable panic on the morning following Mrs. Bramwell's death. His apprehension was accomplished without drama. He offered no resistance, made no attempt at flight, and in fact seemed almost relieved to be relieved of the burden of his own conscience. The young man's appearance had deteriorated considerably during his days of concealment. His face bore the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had not slept adequately in some considerable time, and his hands trembled with a constancy that suggested either terror or the onset of some nervous collapse. When confronted with the evidence of his complicity, the letters, the account ledger, the key to the larder, he offered no denial, but rather collapsed into a chair with the aspect of a man whose capacity for resistance had been utterly exhausted. "I didn't know she would kill her," he said, the words emerging in a voice barely above a whisper. "When Mrs. Bramwell began asking questions, I told Mrs. Vellicott, I told her that the housekeeper was becoming suspicious. I thought she would simply abandon the arrangement, perhaps disappear as she had threatened to do if the constabulary became involved. I never thought, I couldn't have anticipated that she would." He broke off, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence, his entire frame seeming to contract inward as though attempting to escape from the weight of his own comprehension. Whimsy observed this collapse with the detached interest of a man examining some particularly complex mechanism that had failed to function according to its design. "You are attempting to suggest," he said, his tone conveying neither sympathy nor judgment, but rather a clinical precision of language, "that you possessed no knowledge of Mrs. Vellicott's intention to administer a fatal dose of laudanum to Mrs. Bramwell, that you were guilty of complicity in theft, but innocent of complicity in murder. An interesting distinction, and one that the courts may or may not accept as legally significant." "I swear it," Theodore said, desperation lending a note of genuine conviction to his words. "I knew she was ruthless. She made that clear from the beginning. But I thought she would simply leave, disappear back to wherever she had come from. I never imagined she would commit murder." And yet, Whimsy continued, settling himself into a chair with the air of a man preparing for an extended disquisition, "You fled the manor house on the morning following Mrs. Bramwell's death. You did not remain to express grief or shock, or any of the emotions that an innocent son of the household might be expected to manifest. Instead, you packed a bag, withdrew a substantial sum from your bank account — I assume we shall discover this when we examine the financial records — and established yourself in lodgings under an assumed name in a seaside resort. This is not the behavior of a man who believed himself innocent. Theodore's resistance crumbled entirely at this observation. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice breaking. "When I learned that Mrs. Bramwell was dead, I realized that Mrs. Vellicott had taken matters into her own hands. I realized that I had, through my own foolishness and weakness, been the instrument through which a woman had gained access to my home and used that access to commit murder. I was terrified that I would be discovered, that I would be charged with complicity, that my family would learn the full extent of my betrayal." Inspector Marchbanks, who had been conducting his own examination of Theodore's lodgings, produced at this moment a small leather portfolio containing correspondence that proved considerably more illuminating than even Whimsy's astute observations had anticipated. The letters within documented, in Mrs. Vellicott's educated hand, her systematic manipulation of Theodore and her clear intention to exploit the situation for considerably larger purposes than simple theft. "My dear Theodore, read one particularly damning missive. Dated 5 days before the murder, I must confess that our arrangement has proven considerably more lucrative than I had initially anticipated. The items removed from your household's larder, while charming in their way, represent only a fraction of what might be accomplished with proper planning. I have become aware of certain additional opportunities within your family's collection. Items of considerably greater value that might be removed if we coordinate our efforts with appropriate timing. I have also become aware that your household contains certain documents of considerable importance relating to property holdings and inheritance arrangements. These documents would be of profound interest to certain individuals who have retained my services for rather more comprehensive work than I have thus far undertaken. I shall explain my intentions more fully upon our next meeting. In the interim, I must request your absolute discretion and your continued cooperation." Whimsy's expression, upon reading this passage, underwent a subtle transformation that suggested he had just encountered something of considerably greater magnitude and significance than the relatively simple crime of household robbery that had initially presented itself. "Mrs. Vellicott," he said slowly, "was not merely a common thief with an unusual opportunity. She was a professional criminal, operating on commission for parties unknown, with intentions that extended far beyond the acquisition of silver plate and candied fruits. Theodore's value to her lay not in his access to portable valuables, but in his potential access to documents, information, and family secrets that possessed considerably greater consequence." He turned to Theodore with an intensity that made the young man flinch. What documents was she referring to? What information did she attempt to obtain from you regarding your family's property and inheritance arrangements? Theodore appeared to struggle between the desire to maintain whatever remained of his dignity and the need to purge himself of the weight of his knowledge. "She asked me about Father's will," he said finally. "She asked me whether he had made provisions for his younger sister, Aunt Constance, who was estranged from the family some years ago. She seemed particularly interested in the circumstances of the estrangement and whether Aunt Constance had any claim upon the estate, whether there were any irregularities in the property settlements." Whimsy's entire demeanor altered at this revelation, as though some crucial piece of an invisible puzzle had suddenly materialized. He rose abruptly and turned to address Inspector Marchbanks with an urgency that suggested they had been examining only the surface manifestations of a considerably more extensive and deliberate crime. "Mrs. Vellicott," he said, "is not Mrs. Vellicott at all. She is, unless my powers of deduction have entirely failed me, Constance Ashworth, your father's estranged sister." The revelation produced a silence of considerable duration. during which Theodore's face underwent a series of transformations suggestive of profound cognitive and emotional disturbance. Inspector Marchbanks, whose experience in criminal investigation had not previously encompassed cases of such labyrinthine complexity, extracted a notebook and began recording Whimsy's pronouncements with the dedication of a man attempting to commit to paper something that defied his rational comprehension. Constance Ashworth, Whimsy continued, beginning to pace the modest confines of the Brighton lodging house with the restlessness of a man engaged in the process of assembling disparate elements into coherent pattern, disappeared from the family approximately 30 years ago, if my recollection serves correctly. She was involved in some scandal, a romantic entanglement that your father deemed unsuitable, I believe, and was effectively exiled from the household and the family circle. One heard rumors, from time to time, of her existence in various continental cities, but nothing was ever confirmed, and certainly nothing was made public beyond the immediate family. He paused before Theodore, fixing him with an intensity that seemed to penetrate through the young man's defenses. "Your father never mentioned her to you? Never explained the circumstances of her departure, or the reasons for the estrangement?" Theodore shook his head miserably. "Father never spoke of her at all. When I was young and asked questions about the matter, I was simply told that she had made choices that were incompatible with family honor, and that her name was not to be mentioned. It was treated as though she had died, or had never existed." Precisely, Whimsy said with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been confirmed by empirical evidence, which means that Constance Ashworth possessed an extraordinary motive for undertaking this elaborate scheme. She had been denied not merely affection, but recognition, inheritance, and the basic acknowledgement of her existence within the family structure. 30 years is a considerable time in which to nurture grievance, to develop cunning, and to plan a revenge that would be not merely destructive, but devastatingly precise in its execution. He turned to address Marchbanks directly. The woman who called herself Mrs. Velicott would have required considerable resources to accomplish what she has accomplished. Resources that suggest either considerable personal wealth or the patronage of individuals prepared to invest in her schemes. I would conjecture that she has been operating over an extended period as an agent for parties with a vested interest in undermining the Ashworth family's holdings and social position. Whether these parties represent creditors attempting to recover debts, business rivals, or something considerably more complex remains to be determined. But the sophistication of this operation suggests professional planning and considerable financial backing. Inspector Marchbanks began making notes with increased urgency. "Then we must assume," he said, "that she remains at large and represents a continuing danger not merely to this household, but potentially to others who might be involved in her schemes. The question becomes, where would she have gone? What would her next move be?" Whimsy produced from his pocket the smudged postmark that he had examined weeks earlier at Blackthorn Cottage, and subjected it now to considerably more intense scrutiny. "This letter," he said, "despite the deliberate obscuring of the postmark, bears certain characteristics that suggest it originated from correspondence flowing through the continental postal system. The quality of the paper is French, the watermark is consistent with a particular Parisian manufacturer. Mrs. Velicott, Constance Ashworth, has maintained connections abroad, almost certainly utilizing them as safe harbor and means of transit during the execution of her various schemes." He turned to Theodore with an expression combining regret with something approaching grim satisfaction. "You will be charged with complicity in the robbery of your household, and likely with conspiracy in the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Bramwell's death, even if your knowledge of her murderous intentions can be established as limited or belated. The courts will be the arbiter of your ultimate culpability." However, your cooperation in establishing your aunt's identity, her motivations, and the identities of her associates will likely mitigate whatever sentence is ultimately imposed upon you." Whimsy moved to the window of the lodging house, gazing out upon the grey expanse of the sea with an expression suggesting that he was observing something far more distant than the immediate landscape. "What is required now," he said quietly, "is to establish the full scope of Constance Ashworth's intentions. Was the murder of Mrs. Bramwell merely an impediment to be removed, or was it part of a larger design? What documents was she seeking? What information regarding your family's property would have possessed sufficient value to justify the risks she undertook? And most significantly, what is her ultimate objective? Is Shaw content with simple revenge through theft and murder? Or does she harbor ambitions of a considerably more ambitious nature?" He turned from the window to address Theodore with a penetration that seemed to strip away the young man's remaining defenses. "Tell me precisely what she said regarding your family's property holdings. Tell me what inquiries she made, what documents she asked you to obtain, what information she seemed most interested in acquiring. Hold nothing back, for if you do, you may find yourself complicit not merely in a crime of passion, but in a conspiracy of considerably greater scope and consequence." Theodore, faced with the full weight of Whimsy's intellect and the inexorable logic of consequences he could no longer evade, began to speak with increasing urgency, revealing conversations that had never been recorded, intentions that had been conveyed through innuendo and suggestion rather than explicit statement. And as he spoke, it became increasingly apparent that Constance Ashworth's ambitions extended far beyond simple revenge, and that the murder of Mrs. Bramwell represented merely the most visible manifestation of a scheme whose true dimensions and objectives remained yet to be fully apprehended. The information extracted from Theodore's reluctant testimony painted a portrait of conspiracy considerably more extensive and potentially more devastating than even Whimsy's acute perceptions had anticipated. Constance Ashworth had been methodically assembling documentation regarding the Ashworth family's property holdings, with particular emphasis upon certain parcels of land in Kent that had been in the family's possession for nearly 2 centuries. These lands, she had indicated to Theodore through careful suggestion rather than explicit statement, contained mineral rights that had never been properly exploited, and which possessed considerable value to certain industrial concerns. Furthermore, she had been interested in determining whether Roderick's younger brother, Theodore's Uncle Geoffrey, who lived abroad and had severed most contact with the family 20 years prior, retained any legal claim to portions of the family estate. The implications were staggering. Constance Ashworth, operating with the backing of industrial speculators or foreign interests, had been attempting to establish grounds for contesting the legitimacy of Roderick's current holdings, or alternatively, to locate and manipulate relatives whose claims might supersede his authority. The theft of the household valuables, in this context, represented not the primary objective, but rather a preliminary probe, a means of establishing access, testing the household's vulnerability, and determining what additional information might be obtained through continued manipulation of young Theodore. The woman was attempting to engineer a legal challenge to your father's estate, Whimsy explained to Roderick, who had been summoned from the manor to the Scotland Yard offices where Theodore was being held pending formal charges. She possessed, or believed she possessed, evidence that might call into question the disposition of certain properties. Whether this evidence was genuine or fabricated remains to be determined, but her confidence in pursuing the matter suggests she had something of substance with which to work. Roderick's face had assumed the grey, hollowed appearance of a man confronting the systematic dismantling of everything he believed secure. "But my father's will is entirely in order," he protested weakly. "Everything was established through the proper legal channels, overseen by solicitors of the highest repute. There is nothing to challenge, nothing to contest." "Perhaps not," Whimsy conceded. But the mere initiation of such a challenge, conducted through foreign intermediaries and leveraging the cooperation of your own son, would have subjected your family to considerable expense, embarrassment, and uncertainty. The delay alone in resolving such matters might have disrupted your ability to negotiate certain business arrangements, might have damaged your credit with various banking institutions, might have exposed your family to considerable public scrutiny and gossip. In short, the objective was not necessarily to succeed in the legal challenge, but to inflict damage through the mere act of challenging. He turned his attention to the documents that had been recovered from Theodore's lodgings and from Constance's correspondence with the young man. Among these were architectural sketches of the Kent properties, geological surveys suggesting the presence of valuable mineral deposits, and most significantly, a series of letters from a legal firm operating out of Amsterdam, indicating that they represented certain unnamed clients with a vested interest in the Ashworth family's mineral rights. These clients, Wimsey said, indicating the correspondence with a gesture of manifest distaste, appear to be either industrial concerns or state interests from continental Europe, seeking to acquire or contest the family's holdings. Constance Ashworth has been employed as their agent, utilizing her insider knowledge of the family and her personal animosity toward your father to establish grounds for legal action. When your family proved resistant to simple manipulation, and when Mrs. Bramwell's investigations threatened to expose the scheme prematurely, Constance made the decision to remove the obstacle, a decision that demonstrates both her ruthlessness and her desperation. Inspector Marchbanks produced at this moment a telegraph that had arrived within the preceding hour, bearing news that proved considerably more urgent than even the preceding revelations. "We have located evidence," he announced, "that Constance Ashworth departed the country 2 days ago, traveling on a false passport from Dover to Calais. She is almost certainly on the continent by now, making pursuit considerably more complicated and politically delicate." Wimsey's expression underwent that subtle transformation, which indicated he had encountered an obstacle requiring creative solution. "Then we must ensure," he said quietly, "that she possesses no opportunity to communicate her schemes or to coordinate further actions with her continental associates. The moment she realizes that Theodore has been apprehended and that her agent has revealed the extent of her conspiracy, she will recognize that the immediate objectives have failed. She may, however, be motivated to ensure that no surviving evidence of her involvement can be utilized against her. There are certain documents which she would particularly wish to retrieve or destroy." He turned to Roderick with an intensity that suggested he had just recognized something of critical importance. "Your brother Geoffrey," he said abruptly, "the one living abroad, who has severed contact with the family. Do you maintain any correspondence with him? Do you know precisely where he is currently residing?" Roderick appeared baffled by this sudden shift in direction. "Geoffrey is in Switzerland, I believe. Zurich, or possibly Geneva. We exchange letters perhaps once or twice annually, but the contact is formal and minimal. Why would you?" "Because," Wimsey interrupted, "Constance Ashworth's next move, should she prove sufficiently desperate or sufficiently convinced of her ultimate failure, would be to attempt to establish direct contact with your brother. His cooperation would be considerably more valuable to her than your father's obstruction has been. If she can convince him that he has been cheated of his inheritance, that he possesses legitimate grounds for contesting your father's estate, she may yet salvage something from this elaborate scheme. And if she succeeds in persuading him to initiate a legal challenge from abroad, the complications would be sufficiently severe that a criminal prosecution might become secondary to civil proceedings." He rose with sudden decisiveness and turned to address Inspector Marchbanks. "We must send telegrams immediately to the British consular offices in Geneva and Zurich, warning them regarding Constance Ashworth's identity, her intentions, and her likely attempt to make contact with Geoffrey Ashworth." We must also inform the continental authorities and request their assistance in locating and apprehending her. Speed is now the essential element. Every hour that passes increases the probability that she will succeed in establishing contact with your brother and in convincing him to cooperate with her scheme. The denouement, when it arrived, proved considerably less dramatic than the preceding weeks of investigation and revelation, though in its own fashion considerably more profound in its implications regarding human nature and the consequences of unchecked resentment. Geoffrey Ashworth, upon receiving the warning communicated through the British Consular Office in Geneva, demonstrated a commendable degree of rational judgment that stood in marked contrast to his younger nephew's susceptibility to manipulation. He immediately placed himself under the protection of the Swiss authorities and forwarded to them all correspondence he had received from parties claiming to represent legal interests in the Ashworth family holdings. The letters, when examined by Wimsey and the assembled legal experts, proved to be precisely what they appeared: the carefully constructed framework of a scheme designed to exploit familial discord and Geoffrey's potential resentment at being excluded from family affairs. Constance Ashworth was apprehended in Brussels, attempting to board a train destined for Vienna under yet another assumed identity. She was traveling under the name of Madame Leclerc, carrying forged documentation and a considerable quantity of currency in multiple denominations, the proceeds, one might conjecture, of her various criminal enterprises conducted over an extended period. She offered no resistance upon apprehension, and in fact appeared almost relieved to have her elaborate deceptions brought to conclusion. The interrogation that followed, conducted in the presence of representatives from both Scotland Yard and the Belgian authorities, revealed a woman of considerable intelligence and, one must acknowledge, a certain tragic dimension that extended beyond the simple categorization of criminal or victim. Constance Ashworth had indeed been exiled from the family 3 decades prior, following an affair with a man of insufficient social standing and considerable political radicalism. The scandal had been handled with the discretion characteristic of families of the Ashworth standing, which is to say that she had been effectively erased from the family records and forbidden any contact with relatives or family properties. She had subsequently married the man in question, only to discover that he had married her primarily for access to the family's connections. When that access was denied, he had abandoned her, leaving her alone in Paris with minimal resources and considerable bitterness. Over the following decades, she had reinvented herself repeatedly, moving through European society with impressive adaptability, acquiring skills in forgery, investigation, and criminal manipulation. At some point, the exact timing remained unclear, she had been contacted by representatives of industrial interests seeking leverage against the Ashworth family. They had recognized her as an asset of considerable value, a family insider possessing detailed knowledge of the household, motivated by personal grievance, and sufficiently detached from any moral or legal constraints to undertake activities that would horrify more conventional individuals. The scheme regarding the mineral rights was entirely genuine, she explained with a detachment that bordered upon the clinical. The industrial concerns she represented had been seeking acquisition of those properties for nearly a decade. The Ashworth family's reluctance to sell had necessitated alternative approaches. Constance had been initially engaged simply to gather information regarding the family's vulnerabilities and potential leverage points. Theodore's presence in the village, his obvious financial difficulties, his desperate attachment to the appearance of respectability despite his actual insolvency, these had all presented opportunities of remarkable convenience. "I did not intend to kill the housekeeper," she stated with apparent sincerity, though whether this represented genuine remorse or merely tactical positioning remained ambiguous. The woman was unnecessary. She had begun to suspect the nature of the arrangement, but she possessed no proof that would have withstood legal scrutiny. Her death was an error of judgment on the part of Calvert, who became panicked when informed of her inquiries. I had instructed him merely to prevent her from communicating with the authorities. He exceeded his instructions. Whimsy, attending this interrogation in his capacity as a consulting agent for the Home Office, received this explanation with the expression of a man listening to a classical recitation performed with technical proficiency but insufficient emotional comprehension. "Mr. Calvert," he observed dryly, "has apparently become considerably less forthcoming regarding the precise nature of his role in events. He maintains that he acted entirely under your instruction and at your explicit request. One of you, one presumes, is considerably less than truthful." Constance's expression remained unmoved. "Calvert is a fool," she said with absolute finality. "He was useful for his knowledge of the household and his lack of moral constraint. When utility becomes liability, it ceases to matter whether one tells the truth or the convenient fiction. I am quite prepared to accept responsibility for Mrs. Bramwell's death, as I suspect the courts will hold me responsible in any event. The question is whether this final crime will be prosecuted in England or whether continental authorities will claim jurisdiction for my various other enterprises conducted on their soil." The legal proceedings that followed occupied several months and involved the coordinated efforts of authorities in 3 separate nations. Constance Ashworth was ultimately tried for the murder of Mrs. Bramwell in England, convicted upon Whimsy's testimony and the assembled physical evidence, and sentenced to 20 years' imprisonment. The charges regarding the theft from the Ashworth household were eventually dropped in exchange for her cooperation in identifying her various associates and providing information regarding the industrial concerns that had engaged her services. Geoffrey Ashworth, having been fully apprised of his sister's machinations and the threat they posed to the family's interests, demonstrated unexpected magnanimity by declining to pursue civil action against his brother's estate, though he did accept a substantially increased settlement regarding his own inheritance, a resolution that Whimsy privately considered a triumph of pragmatism over familial sentiment. Theodore was sentenced to 18 months' imprisonment for his complicity in the theft, with a strong recommendation for leniency from the judge, who appeared to harbor considerable sympathy for a young man whose principal crime had been weakness of character combined with financial desperation. Lord Peter Whimsy departed the matter with his characteristic combination of intellectual satisfaction and human melancholy, delivering to Roderick Ashworth, on the occasion of their final meeting, a parting observation that seemed to encapsulate his understanding of the affair's essential tragedy. "Your sister," he said, accepting a final whiskey before his departure, "was undoubtedly a woman of considerable capability and intelligence. Had she possessed either affection or a modicum of forgiveness toward her family, she might have become a woman of genuine distinction. Instead, she chose to transmute her resentment into elaborate schemes of revenge. The pity of it is that her greatest revenge ultimately lay not in legal documents or contested inheritances, but in the simple fact that her family, having ignored her existence for 3 decades, will now be unable to forget her actions for the remainder of their lives. That, one might suggest, constitutes a victory of sorts, though scarcely one that would be envied by any rational observer.